Have you ever wondered how many times a heart can break before it stops hoping? How many times can someone be abandoned before they stop believing in love, in trust, in home? This is the story of Ghost, a giant pit bull who was returned to the shelter 3 times. Too big, too scary, too much of a risk. No one gave him a chance, until one man did. But was it too late? Could a dog that had been discarded over and over again still believe in second chances? Stay until the end. This is a story that will move you, challenge you, and leave you with a powerful lesson about loyalty, love, and never giving up. And if you believe in the power of stories like this, help Veil Marks reach 1,000 subscribers, because every single one of you helps keep these stories alive. Let's begin. The rain poured relentlessly, hammering against the metal roof of the animal shelter. The air was thick with the smell of wet concrete and damp fur, the scent of uncertainty clinging to every corner of the dimly lit kennel. A lone figure stood outside, motionless beneath the cold sheets of rain, his massive frame outlined by the flickering glow of the street lamp nearby. His fur, once pristine white, was now speckled with dirt, his paws sinking slightly into the mud pooling beneath him. He didn't shiver, didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring down the long stretch of road where the car had disappeared into the night. It had happened again. Ghost didn't know how long he had been standing there, watching, waiting, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. That the car's red taillights would blink back on, that the tires would screech against the wet pavement, and that his owner would come running, calling his name, telling him it had all been a mistake. But deep inside, he knew. It was never a mistake. It was always the same. The shelter worker let out a long sigh as she pulled the hood of her jacket tighter around her face, stepping toward the silent pit bull. She didn't need to say anything. She had seen this scene play out too many times before. "Come on, boy," she murmured, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the downpour. "Let's get you inside." Ghost didn't resist when she clipped the leash to his collar. He didn't protest as she led him back into the building, past the rows of barking dogs, some pressing against their cages in excitement, others whining softly as they curled into themselves. He walked with the weight of a creature that had long given up on resisting fate. His cage was still open from earlier that day, the thin blanket inside crumpled from where he had slept the night before. He stepped inside without being told, turned once in a slow, practiced motion, and lay down with his head resting against his front paws. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound final and familiar. 3 times. 3 times he had been taken from this place, and 3 times he had been brought back. The first time, Ghost had barely been more than a puppy, his oversized paws clumsy, his eyes filled with unfiltered excitement and hope. A young couple had chosen him, enchanted by his striking white coat, charmed by the way he nuzzled into their hands, eager to please. They had brought him home, showered him with treats, let him sleep at the foot of their bed. But then, he grew, and he kept growing. At 1 year old, he was already massive, larger than most pit bulls, his body all muscle, his stance unintentionally intimidating. He had never snapped, never lunged, never done anything remotely aggressive, but it hadn't mattered. "He's too strong," the man had said, rubbing his wrist after a walk where Ghost had pulled too hard on the leash. "We can't control him." And just like that, he was back at the shelter. The second time, Ghost had been more hesitant. He had wagged his tail, but with caution, unsure if happiness was something he was still allowed to feel. An older man had adopted him, someone who lived alone, someone who claimed to want a dog for companionship. For weeks, Ghost had done everything right. He had learned to sit on command, to stay beside his owner without tugging on the leash, to wait patiently for his food. But there was always a distance, an unease in the way the man looked at him. Then, one day, the man had stood in the doorway of his house, watching Ghost from across the room. "He looks at me like he wants to attack," the man had muttered to the shelter worker over the phone. Ghost had only been watching, waiting for his owner to call him over, to give him a sign of affection. But whatever the man had seen in his amber eyes had been enough. And so, he had been brought back again. The third time was the worst. A woman had come in, eyes wary but hopeful, saying she was willing to give a pit bull a chance. She had taken him home, introduced him to her 2 young children, let him sniff around the house with tentative curiosity. Ghost had been careful. He had stayed still when the kids clambered around him. He had followed every command, had been nothing but gentle. But 1 week later, he had heard the hushed whispers over the phone, the nervous glances in his direction. "I can't keep him," she had said. "The neighbors are worried he's, a pit bull." As if that alone had been enough of a reason. And then, he had found himself back at the shelter. Again. Ghost exhaled through his nose, his massive chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm as he lay motionless in his kennel. The sounds of the shelter swirled around him, the frantic scratching of paws against metal cages, the desperate whimpers of dogs longing for someone to take them home, the occasional echo of a person's voice asking about adoption. But he had stopped hoping. At first, he had tried to understand. Had he been too big, too quiet, too much of something, or maybe not enough? What was it about him that made people turn away? But now, he no longer asked those questions. The answer didn't matter. All he knew was that when someone came to adopt him next, he would walk out of this place, step into another home, try again to be the dog they wanted, and sooner or later he would find himself right back here. Because Ghost had learned a truth that had settled deep in his bones, a truth he could no longer ignore. Some dogs were meant to find a home, and some were meant to be left behind. The shelter worker knelt down beside his kennel, resting her fingers against the metal bars. "You're a good boy, Ghost," she murmured, as if that might change anything. Ghost didn't move, didn't blink, didn't dare to believe her. Because the last time someone had called him a good boy, they had left him standing in the rain, and they had never come back. The fluorescent lights in the shelter flickered slightly, casting a dull glow over the rows of kennels lining the walls. The air carried a familiar mix of damp fur, cleaning solution, and something more intangible, something heavier. It was the scent of waiting, of uncertainty, of countless souls suspended in limbo, hoping for a second chance, or, in Ghost's case, a fourth. He had stopped lifting his head whenever the door creaked open. The sound of approaching footsteps meant nothing to him anymore. A stranger would come, voices would murmur, hands would gesture toward other dogs. And then, like always, they would walk past his cage, their eyes flicking over him briefly before moving on. It was better this way. Hope was a dangerous thing. But that day was different. The man who entered wasn't like the others. He was older, his face lined with the kind of weariness that couldn't be traced back to just age. His frame was broad but slightly hunched, his shoulders carrying something unseen. His jeans were worn, his boots coated in a fine layer of dust, as if he had walked a long road just to be here. He didn't stop to coo at the puppies bouncing excitedly against their cages. He didn't flinch at the frantic barking of the larger dogs vying for his attention. He walked slowly, deliberately, his gaze scanning the kennels with an expression unreadable. Then he stopped. Ghost remained curled in the back of his kennel, his massive frame still as stone. He felt the weight of the man's stare but didn't return it. The silence stretched. Other adopters usually made their decisions quickly. They would call the shelter worker over, ask questions about temperament, training, compatibility. They would look for a dog that wagged its tail, that pressed eagerly against the bars, that seemed to be waiting for them as much as they were looking for it. But this man didn't do any of those things. He simply stood there watching Ghost with the quiet patience of someone who wasn't in a hurry to decide anything. Minutes passed, and then finally he moved. He crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees, his gaze never leaving the dog lying before him. Ghost braced himself for the usual questions. How old is he? Has he been trained? Is he good with kids? But the man didn't ask any of those. Instead, he sighed, ran a hand through his graying hair, and murmured, almost to himself, "Guess you've been through it, huh?" Ghost blinked slowly. The man exhaled again, softer this time. His voice, when it came, was rough, quiet, as if speaking to something fragile. "I don't need a perfect dog," he said. "I just need one who wants to come home." Then, after a moment, he tilted his head and added, almost like an afterthought, "What do you think?" Ghost didn't move, didn't wag his tail, didn't lunge forward in excitement like the others might have. He had learned that home wasn't a place you were taken to. It was a place you were returned from. So he lay there, unmoving, and waited for the man to stand up, to shake his head, to mutter something about him being too broken or too distant or too much of a risk. But the man didn't do any of those things either. Instead, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and got to his feet. "I'll take him." The shelter worker hesitated. "You're sure? He's been returned 3 times." "I'll take him." The words were steady, final. And just like that, for the 4th time in his life, Ghost walked out of the shelter. But this time, there was no leash pulling him forward. No excited chatter about how he would love his new bed or how lucky he was to be chosen. This time, there was only silence. And the man named Ethan. The truck rumbled softly as they drove, the rain tapping lightly against the windshield. Ghost sat in the back seat, his large frame curled into the smallest space possible. He didn't explore, didn't sniff curiously at the unfamiliar scents of leather and dust. Ethan didn't try to coax him forward, didn't try to pet him, didn't try to force comfort where it didn't yet exist. He simply drove, one hand resting on the wheel, the other occasionally adjusting the radio dial as if he had all the time in the world for Ghost to decide what he wanted to do. The drive stretched on, the city giving way to long stretches of road flanked by open fields and thick clusters of trees. Eventually, the truck slowed, turning onto a dirt path lined with wooden fencing. Home, if that's what this place was supposed to be. The house was modest, its wooden siding faded from years of sun and weather, a porch wrapped around the front, an old rocking chair sitting in the corner, motionless in the evening breeze. Beyond the house, the land stretched wide, acres of open space, the scent of earth and grass carried in the air. Ethan cut the engine and got out, leaving the door open. Ghost hesitated, then followed, his paws crunching softly against the gravel driveway. Ethan didn't lead him anywhere. He simply stood beside the truck, hands in his pockets, and waited. Ghost looked around. No fences, no chains, no limits to where he could go. If he wanted to, he could run. He could disappear into the open land, become nothing more than a ghost once again, untethered, unclaimed. Ethan must have known that too, but the man didn't try to stop him. "Come inside if you want," he said finally, turning toward the house. "Or don't. Up to you." Then he stepped onto the porch, pushed the door open, and disappeared inside. Ghost stood there for a long time, the evening air cool against his fur. He wasn't used to choices. Every home he had ever been taken to before had come with expectations. He had been given commands, rules, unspoken conditions he had always failed to meet. But this was different. No one was forcing him to stay. No one was deciding for him. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant scent of something warm, something familiar. A fire, the kind that smelled like safety, like home. Ghost hesitated only a moment longer before stepping forward, his large paws landing softly on the wooden porch. And for the first time in his life, no one told him he didn't belong there. The first night in the new house was silent, but Ghost did not sleep. The bed Ethan had set up for him, a thick, cushioned pad in the corner of the living room, remained untouched. It was warm, far more comfortable than the cold floors of the shelter or the rough ground he had slept on in the past, but Ghost did not trust it. He lay instead on the hardwood floor, body curled tight, ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. The wind outside whistled through the trees, the occasional creak of the old house settling in the night. He had learned long ago that comfort was temporary, that the moment he let his guard down, the world would remind him that he did not belong. Ethan had gone to bed hours ago, his footsteps fading up the stairs, leaving Ghost alone with his thoughts. The house was still, but Ghost remained alert, his eyes open, his breathing shallow. The faintest movements made his muscles tense, shadows shifting against the walls, the distant hoot of an owl outside, the rustling of leaves. It was not fear. Not exactly. It was waiting. Ghost had learned to wait. He waited to be noticed. He waited to be praised. He waited to be corrected. He waited for the moment it would all go wrong. Some habits did not break easily. The days passed in much the same way. Ethan did not force anything. He did not tell Ghost to sit when he did not want to. Did not try to coax him into playing with the collection of toys that sat untouched in the corner. Did not scold him for staying near the door rather than claiming a space of his own. He simply let Ghost exist, and Ghost did not know what to do with that. He moved through the house like a ghost in every sense of the word, silent, unnoticed, unsure of whether he truly belonged. He did not sleep on the bed, did not touch the chew toys, did not explore beyond the areas he had been given permission to. He ate only when Ethan was not in the room, waited until the sound of the man's footsteps faded before approaching the food bowl. Even then, he ate quickly, finishing before anyone had the chance to change their mind and take it away. He did not know what would make Ethan regret bringing him here, but he knew it was only a matter of time. And then, one night, it happened. It had been an accident. Ghost had been pacing near the kitchen, restless, his paws clicking softly against the wooden floor. Ethan had left a metal bowl on the counter, just a simple dish, nothing special, nothing dangerous. But when Ghost turned too sharply, his tail brushed against the edge, and the bowl crashed to the ground. The sound was deafening in the quiet house. Ghost froze. The reaction was instant, automatic. His body tensed, his ears flattened, his legs locked into place. His breathing came sharp and shallow as his mind raced back to all the times before, times when noise meant trouble, when accidents were met with anger, with shouting, with punishment. His instincts screamed at him to make himself small, to disappear. His feet carried him before he had time to think, his body pressing into the tightest corner he could find, his head ducked low, his tail curled close. His entire frame shook with the certainty of what was to come. He did not look up. He did not dare. Footsteps approached. Slow, measured. The weight of them sent a tremor through his chest, but he did not move. His breath came in shallow puffs, his heart hammering against his ribs. And then, silence. A long pause stretched between them. Then a sigh. The footsteps stopped, and instead of a harsh voice, instead of the expected reprimand, a soft, tired murmur filled the air. "Not gonna hurt you, boy." Ghost's ears flicked slightly, the only sign he had heard. He still did not look up. Ethan moved again, but not toward him. Instead, there was the quiet shuffle of fabric, the creak of the wooden floor as he lowered himself to sit. He did not close the space between them, did not try to force comfort where it was not yet welcome. He simply sat there, leaning back against the cabinets, legs stretched out in front of him. Seconds passed. Minutes. Ghost did not move. Neither did Ethan. There was no anger in his voice when he finally spoke again, only something gentler, something softer, something that felt foreign to Ghost's ears. "Nobody's gonna hurt you here." It was not a command, not a reassurance meant to convince. It was simply a truth, stated as fact, as if it was not something that needed proving. Ghost's body remained locked in place, but his breathing slowed. His ears twitched at the sound of Ethan shifting, at the quiet clink of the metal bowl being picked up and placed back onto the counter. Nothing else happened. No hands reaching to grab him, no raised voice, no punishment. Ethan sighed again, the weight of the day evident in his voice. He stood with a quiet grunt, stretching slightly before turning toward the stairs. "Come to bed when you're ready," was all he said before disappearing down the hall. Ghost remained in the corner long after the man was gone. He did not know what to make of it, because in every place before this, mistakes had consequences, loud noises had consequences, simply existing the wrong way had consequences. And yet, here he was, still here, still wanted. But was it real? Or was it just a delay before the inevitable? Ghost did not have the answer, but for the first time, as he crept back toward his sleeping spot near the fireplace, as he curled into himself and let the warmth seep into his fur, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The early morning light filtered through the farmhouse windows, casting a golden hue over the wooden floors. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh hay from the fields outside. In the quiet of the house, only the steady creak of Ethan's old rocking chair could be heard as he sat on the porch, sipping coffee from a worn ceramic mug. Ghost lay a few feet away, stretched out on the cool wooden planks, his head resting on his front paws. He wasn't asleep. Not really. His ears flicked at every distant sound, the rustling of leaves, the faint mooing of cows in a nearby pasture, the occasional groan of the wind against the house. But he stayed where he was, close but not too close, watching Ethan with the same quiet observation that had become their routine. Ethan exhaled slowly, setting his mug down on the porch railing. His gaze drifted over the land stretching out before him, but his mind was somewhere else, somewhere in the past. It had been years, but the memories never truly faded. There had been another dog once, a long time ago, a shepherd mix with eyes too smart for his own good, a tail that never stopped wagging, and a fierce loyalty that had once been the only constant in Ethan's life. His name had been Rusty, and then one day, he was gone. It had been an ordinary morning, much like this one. Ethan had let Rusty out to roam the property, as he always did, trusting the dog would return like he had every day before. But that day was different. That day, Rusty never came back. Ethan had searched, through the fields, down the long dirt road, even into the neighboring town. He had checked with the local shelter, put up flyers, called every number he could think of. But there had been nothing. No sign, no trace. Just silence. And for the first time in his life, Ethan had learned what it felt like to come home to a house that was no longer whole. He hadn't gotten another dog after that. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't think he could go through that loss again. Yet, here he was. He glanced at Ghost, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, the way the dog's amber eyes stayed half-lidded but never fully relaxed. Ghost wasn't Rusty. Rusty had been full of life, eager, always looking for affection. Ghost, on the other hand, was cautious, distant, always bracing for disappointment. But in some ways, they were the same, because Ethan could see it. the weight Ghost carried, the quiet expectation of abandonment that lingered in the way he never let himself get too comfortable. They were both waiting for the other to leave. Ethan let out a slow breath, reaching out without thinking, letting his fingers brush against Ghost's fur. The movement was small, unintentional even, just the lightest contact as he ran his hand over the thick muscle of the pit bull's shoulder. And for the first time, Ghost didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He didn't lean into it either. But that didn't matter. It was something. A step. A bridge between past and present, between fear and trust. The days passed, and the changes were small but noticeable. Ghost still didn't play. He still ate only when Ethan wasn't watching. He still slept on the floor instead of his bed. But there were moments, tiny, barely perceptible shifts, that spoke louder than any grand gesture ever could. One morning, Ethan woke to find Ghost sitting by the foot of his bed instead of in the living room. He hadn't climbed onto the mattress, hadn't curled up close like a dog who trusted his place in a home. But he was there, closer than before. A few days later, when Ethan walked out to the barn, Ghost followed. Not from a distance, not just to patrol the perimeter. He walked beside him, not quite touching, but close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of his presence. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something. And something was enough. Ethan knew it would take time, maybe months, maybe longer. But they were the same, he and this dog. Both of them had lost something. Both of them had learned not to expect much from the world. And maybe that was exactly why they had found each other. Maybe for the first time in a long time, neither of them had to go through it alone. But there was still one more test, one more moment that would decide if Ghost would ever truly believe he belonged here. Because all it would take was a single event, one unexpected challenge, to prove whether Ghost was just waiting for another door to close, or if he had finally found a home worth staying in. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that settled too deeply, pressing into the walls, thickening the air. Outside, the wind barely whispered through the trees. The fields stretched endlessly into the dark, their emptiness masking the presence of something unseen. Ghost lay curled on the wooden floor near the back door, his breathing slow but never fully at rest. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow that flickered along the edges of the room. Ethan had gone to bed hours ago, the steady rhythm of his footsteps retreating up the stairs before the house fell silent. Ghost had learned to recognize the sounds of the farm, the gentle creak of the windmill, the occasional hoot of an owl, the way the old pipes groaned when the temperature dropped. But something was different tonight. Something was wrong. His ears twitched. A sound, so faint most wouldn't notice it. But he did. A shift in the air, the almost imperceptible scrape of metal against wood. Ghost lifted his head, muscles tensing beneath his thick coat. His amber eyes flicked toward the front door, his instincts kicking in before his mind could fully register what was happening. Someone was here. A shadow moved past the window, blocking out the moonlight for just a second. Ghost rose to his feet, his breath steady but shallow. He took a step forward, then stopped. His mind screamed at him to stay put. He had learned, hadn't he? Don't react, don't fight back, don't make a sound. It was a lesson beaten into him in his past life. The punishment had always come swiftly for dogs that didn't obey. His ears flattened, his body tensed, the old voices echoed in his head. Stay still. Stay quiet. Don't make trouble. But then, upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Ghost turned his head, his gaze locking onto the staircase. Ethan was up there. Ethan, the man who had never raised his voice, never lifted a hand in anger. The man who let Ghost choose when to trust, who never forced anything, who gave him space to exist without fear. Ethan was asleep, unaware, vulnerable. The intruder wouldn't just take something. He would take everything. And for the first time, Ghost understood something deeper than fear. This was his home now, and home was worth protecting. The lock on the front door clicked. The knob twisted. The door opened just enough for a boot to step inside. Ghost moved before his mind could stop him. A low, guttural growl rumbled from his chest, a sound he hadn't made in years. The intruder froze, caught between stepping forward and turning back. Ghost bared his teeth, stepping forward with slow, deliberate intent. His hackles rose, his body shifting into something primal. The man made his decision. He lunged. Ghost met him mid-air. They crashed against the wooden floor, the force of the impact rattling the furniture. The man's breath left him in a sharp grunt as Ghost's weight drove him back. Hands scrambled against thick fur, trying to shove him away, but Ghost was faster, stronger. The intruder swung, landing a sharp blow against Ghost's side. Pain shot through him, but he didn't back down. This was different. This wasn't a beating from an owner who had already given up on him. This wasn't punishment for being unwanted. This was his fight. Ghost twisted, snapping at the man's arm, forcing him back. The intruder cursed, reaching for something in his pocket. A flash of steel. A knife. Ghost lunged before it could be used. His jaws clamped down, not to kill, just to stop, to end this. The man yelped, his body twisting in an attempt to break free. The knife clattered to the ground. Heavy footsteps thundered down the stairs. "Ghost!" Ethan's voice, rough with sleep but alert, sharp, present. The sound was enough. Ghost released his grip, stepping back, his chest rising and falling in heavy, controlled breaths. The man scrambled to his feet, holding his bleeding arm, wild eyes darting between the dog and the man, now standing at the foot of the stairs. Ethan didn't hesitate. The shotgun resting against the wall was in his hands in seconds. The click of it being loaded was loud in the quiet house. "Get out," Ethan said, his voice steady. The man didn't wait to argue. He bolted, stumbling toward the door, disappearing into the night. The distant roar of an engine signaled his escape down the dirt road. Silence settled once more. Ethan let out a breath, lowering the shotgun. His gaze shifted to Ghost. The dog stood in the middle of the room, his body still tense, his breath labored, his amber eyes locked onto the door, as if expecting another attack. Blood smeared the side of his mouth, not his own. Ethan took a slow step forward. Ghost didn't flinch, didn't retreat, didn't run. Instead, for the first time, he met Ethan's gaze head-on, and Ethan understood. This wasn't just a dog that had been returned 3 times. This wasn't just a pit bull people had feared. This was his dog. Ethan knelt, reaching out a hand. Ghost watched him for a long moment before finally, closing the distance. Ethan's fingers brushed through his fur, his grip steady, warm. "Good boy," he murmured, not out of relief, not out of gratitude, just truth. Ghost let out a slow breath, his body relaxing, his head pressing slightly into Ethan's touch, because for the first time, he believed it. But there was still one question that lingered in the air. After this night, after what had happened, would the world see him as a hero, or just another pit bull who had been dangerous all along? The morning light crept in through the gaps in the curtains, stretching long golden beams across the wooden floor. The house was quiet, except for the steady ticking of the old clock on the wall. Everything should have felt normal, peaceful even, but the weight of the previous night still hung heavy in the air. Ethan stirred, his body protesting as he sat up in bed. The dull ache in his joints reminded him that he wasn't as young as he used to be. His mind was groggy with sleep, but something felt off. And then he saw it. Ghost stood at the bedroom doorway, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. His white fur was streaked with dried blood, not his own, Ethan realized with a sharp inhale. But there were fresh scrapes on his legs, a shallow gash along his shoulder. He was hurt, but he was still standing. And he hadn't left. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Ghost's amber eyes remained locked onto Ethan's, unblinking, unreadable. The silent conversation between them stretched, unspoken words filling the space between man and dog. Ethan swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet pressing into the cold floor. He expected Ghost to take a step back, to shrink away from the movement. But he didn't. The sound of tires crunching against gravel broke the silence. Ethan pushed himself up, walking past Ghost toward the window. Outside, a sheriff's car rolled to a stop near the front porch. The morning sun glinted off the badge pinned to the officer's uniform as he stepped out, his gaze scanning the property before landing on Ethan, who was now making his way down the stairs. By the time Ethan reached the front door, Ghost was at his side. "Morning, Ethan," the sheriff greeted, tipping his hat slightly. His sharp gaze flicked to Ghost, then back to Ethan. "I heard you had some trouble last night." Ethan exhaled, his jaw tightening. "Yeah," he said. "Guy tried to break in." The sheriff nodded, as if he had already figured that much. "Got a report about a man who showed up at the ER with a dog bite. Matches the description of someone we've been keeping an eye on. Looks like your boy here made sure he didn't get too far." Ethan glanced down at Ghost, who sat still, silent, watching the interaction unfold. His body remained tense, as if he expected something bad to follow. "You should get those cuts looked at," the sheriff continued, nodding toward Ghost's injuries. "I will," Ethan said. "He did good." The sheriff studied them for a moment longer before letting out a small chuckle. "Guess you got yourself a hell of a guard dog." Ethan's lips twitched slightly, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. As the sheriff walked back to his car, Ethan turned to Ghost. "Come on, boy," he murmured, stepping back into the house. Ghost hesitated for only a second before following. Inside, the remnants of the previous night's struggle were still visible. A knocked-over chair, a faint smear of blood on the floorboards, the lingering scent of adrenaline in the air. Ethan grabbed a damp cloth from the sink, kneeling down beside Ghost. For years, this dog had flinched at every sudden movement. He had shied away from human touch, his body bracing for pain that never came. But now, as Ethan reached out, Ghost stood firm. Carefully, Ethan wiped the dried blood from Ghost's fur, his movements slow, deliberate. "You're a stubborn one, huh?" he muttered. Took a beating but didn't back down. Ghost didn't react at first. He simply stared, ears slightly tilted back, as if still trying to figure out what all of this meant. And then something changed. The moment was subtle, so small that if Ethan had blinked, he might have missed it. Ghost leaned forward, pressing his massive head lightly against Ethan's shoulder. It wasn't much, just the weight of him, the warmth of his fur against the worn fabric of Ethan's shirt. But it was enough. Ethan's throat tightened. Slowly, carefully, he wrapped his arms around Ghost's thick neck, pulling him in. He felt the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing, the warmth radiating from his body. And for the first time, Ghost did not pull away. For the first time, Ghost was not afraid. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His fingers curled into Ghost's fur, grounding himself in the moment. "You're home," he murmured, his voice rough but steady. "No one's ever gonna take you away again." Ghost didn't move at first. He just stood there, breathing, existing, his body relaxed in a way it never had before. Then, in the smallest, most hesitant motion, his tail wagged. It wasn't much, just a slow, cautious sway, barely noticeable. But Ethan saw it, and his chest ached with something deep and unshakable. This was it, the moment everything changed. Not the fight, not the blood, not the way Ghost had defended his home, but this quiet, unspoken surrender. A choice. Ghost had spent his life being abandoned, being sent away, being returned like something broken. But now, for the first time, he was choosing to stay. Ethan pulled back slightly, resting a hand against Ghost's head. "That's a good boy," he whispered. Ghost let out a small huff, pressing closer. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the fields through the open window. The world was still, the weight of the past no longer hanging so heavy in the air. Ethan didn't need to say anything else. Ghost was home, and this time he would never be left behind again. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet farm. The air smelled of earth and fresh-cut hay, the distant hum of cicadas weaving into the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. It was the kind of evening that stretched endlessly, where time slowed and the world felt lighter. Ethan sat on the worn wooden porch, his old rocking chair creaking slightly beneath him. A cup of coffee rested on the armrest, forgotten, its warmth fading just as the day had begun its slow descent into dusk. But Ethan wasn't paying attention to any of that. His gaze was fixed on the dog lying beside him, stretched out lazily against the porch's cool surface. Ghost. For the first time since Ethan had brought him home, the pit bull wasn't watching the door, wasn't lingering near the edge of the property as if waiting for the inevitable day he would be sent away again. He wasn't curled into himself, tense, waiting for a punishment that would never come. Number Ghost was at ease. His head rested against his paws, his amber eyes half-lidded but peaceful, blinking slowly as he watched the world settle into evening. The scars along his body, once fresh reminders of a past he had barely survived, had faded into something else, something softer, something that no longer defined him. Ethan let out a slow breath, his fingers absent-mindedly brushing against the rim of his coffee cup. For months, Ghost had been waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for Ethan to change his mind, waiting for yet another home to become just another stop on the long road of abandonment. But he wasn't waiting anymore. Ethan could see it in the way the dog's body rested, completely, without hesitation. He could hear it in the way Ghost's breathing was slow and steady, not the sharp, cautious inhales of a dog always ready to run. Ghost had finally chosen to stay. A soft breeze rolled through, stirring the loose strands of Ethan's graying hair. He reached down, running a hand along Ghost's thick fur, feeling the warmth beneath his palm. Ghost sighed contentedly, shifting only slightly, pressing just a little closer. That small movement said more than words ever could. Ethan let out a low chuckle. "Took you long enough," he murmured, his voice rough from years of use, but gentle in a way it hadn't been in a long time. Ghost's tail thumped once against the wood. Ethan smirked. Not long ago, this dog would have flinched at the sound of his voice, would have tensed at an outstretched hand, would have shrunk away, expecting rejection, expecting pain, expecting nothing good. But now, Ghost had finally stopped expecting to be left behind. A lifetime of being unwanted had left its mark, but it had not broken him. And Ethan knew without a doubt that no one would ever take Ghost away from him. They sat there together, in the quiet of the evening, watching as the sky burned gold and pink, as the world exhaled with them. Some things should never be abandoned. Some things deserved to stay, like a home that had waited too long to be filled, like a dog who had never stopped hoping, like a heart that had always been loyal. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee, his free hand resting against Ghost's sturdy frame. "You're home," he said softly, and for the first time, he knew Ghost believed it too. Ghost had spent his entire life waiting for goodbye. Every time he found a home, it was taken away. Every time he trusted, he was abandoned. But not this time. When he stood in the doorway that morning, battered but unbroken, he wasn't waiting to be sent away. He was standing his ground. And for the first time, when Ethan called his name, Ghost didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He chose to stay. Some stories aren't just about dogs. They're about us. About the moments that test us, the people, or animals, who save us, and the belief that no one should be discarded just because they are misunderstood. As the great Helen Keller once said, "Alone, we can do so little. Together, we can do so much." Ghost found his second chance. Will you help Vale Marks reach ours? This channel is built on stories that matter. Stories that make you feel something, stories that deserve to be told. If this story touched you, let us know in the comments. Have you ever had a pet or someone in your life who proved that love is worth the wait? And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Let's hit 1,000 subscribers together. Every click brings us one step closer to making more meaningful, unforgettable stories just like this. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one. Love.